They say that sunshine is the greatest form of disinfectant, and this film certainly sheds a great deal of light on some critical issues for women, not just in STEM, but in fact right across society. How important for you as a filmmaker is that moment where you can spark a conversation or play a role in a critical conversation like this?
Well, I think it's an immense privilege, but I think as a filmmaker and a person, what I get the most fulfillment out of is really when you actually see those real personal, when you can actually really have personal and intimate stories that really show a face to kind of systemic or wider problems, so that you actually can have real emotional engagement with kind of some bigger, wider systemic issues that may sound dry in a policy paper or in a newspaper article. But if you can actually feel something when you're engaging in that, that is kind of, you know, very fulfilling for me.
As someone who's spent a career studying and observing and capturing humanity, what was it like for you to sit there and watch leadership falling apart at a time when they were embarking on a journey to build it? And what did that mean for you from a gender perspective?
Fabian, at the beginning of the film, and always has had this idea that women intrinsically make better leaders than men. And I think she can and does in the film, she talks to that. And I have always had a kind of, I guess, there's been something in me that's been a little bit resistant to that idea, because I feel that we don't want to reduce a set of characteristics that are going to make good leaders to gender. So I think that it's actually really helpful to kind of separate it out from gender in a way, and to kind of look at what works, what doesn't work. And at the moment, you know, I think conversations about leadership and interrogating what works and doesn't work are really relevant.
There's quite clearly been a movement that's been going on for decades, and this is just a part of that story, isn't it?
Yeah, and so one of the things that we're hoping with the film is that it contributes to an ongoing conversation. But I think one of the things that the film really shows is that these are really complex issues, and that there is no kind of easy fix. And I think in some ways there's probably a real desire to be kind of like, just, we know these are issues, but how do we solve them? And what we're hoping for the impact campaign that's going to run alongside the film is that some conversations about more practical strategies, some of what many women on the ship were actually kind of lamenting the lack of when they were on board, about how you actually do achieve societal change, that we can be part of those conversations as well.
Well, Virginia and Janelle are two women who are very much part of that process of enacting significant systems change. So let's have a look at what they had to say when we had a chat earlier this week.
I really want to congratulate Illy. I think it's an excellent documentary. You know, production is beautiful. It's extremely well done. But what a challenge for the documentary makers, because the content is not where I think anyone expected it to go. And it raises a whole lot of questions about leadership programs such as this, about the style of leadership theory that was used on this particular program, and also the responses from the participants. I think probably might have shocked us initially, although I got a hint of it very early on in the piece, I think. But look, overall, I think it's a film that I would encourage everyone to see, because it does challenge you, and it certainly has got us all talking about not just leadership, women in leadership and women in STEM, but also the value of these sorts of programs.
Janelle, this is a film that looks very specifically at discrimination, harassment, abuse, violence against women, even that very fact that the spaces we would assume would be the safest for women can't even guarantee their psychological, let alone physical safety. In your work with UN Women, you work in some of the most challenging communities when it comes to the safety of women, let alone the empowerment and equality of women. what were your reflections on this film in terms of what it sheds light on and how that feeds into what's going on in the rest of the world?
I echo Virginia's congratulations to Illy. It's a really terrific film and definitely thought-provoking. But I think for me, when I reflect on the experience of watching it, it's a reflection of society. Sadly, it's very much a reflection of society. And we see that particularly, just adding to what Virginia's mentioned, when it comes to violence against women. So we assume, as you said, Nicola, that we're able to create these spaces of safety. But sadly, there is no country in the world that has achieved gender equality. And we know that violence against women is one of the most disgusting human rights violations. It's of pandemic proportions all across the world. And so I can't say that I was shocked. It certainly came as a surprise, but sadly it definitely is a mirror of society. And we know that violence against women, it's endemic all across the world, but it does come out in different ways in different parts of the world. And there are some parts of the world where rates are higher. So for example, in the Pacific, UN Women Australia supports quite a number of programs that are working to change social norms and really try to end the power imbalances that lead to high rates of violence against women. But right now we know that 2 in 3 women in the Pacific experience violence, and that's in contrast to 1 in 3, which is a global stat. And I would say any experience of violence is unacceptable, but we know that it does play out in different ways, in different contexts, and at different rates.
What this film really showed was how those issues can impact on women's own view of their potential in the world. And certainly the mission of the Homeward Bound trip was to try and generate a new wave of leadership led by women with a scientific background, coming from a lens of collaboration. And yet, as Virginia, you touched on, the model of leadership that we saw being revealed throughout this film wasn't necessarily reflective of the aspiration for leadership that the film set out to achieve at the very beginning. What do you think that says about where the conversation is in the world today on leadership? And for women in STEM or any industry who are watching this film and thinking about what leadership they should be aspiring to, what are the messages you'd encourage them to take from this?
You know, in many respects, I really do take my hat off to Fabian Dattner. I think she's tried really hard. She's worked on leadership programs for years and years and years, and she's been quite an extraordinary leader herself. I think what comes through in the film is that this particular program, the leadership theory, the gender theory, the lack of diversity theory is all it's all a bit of a muddle. And quite frankly, I think we're at a stage where we've really got to stop and ask ourselves why we keep sending women on leadership courses or programs. Are we trying to focus too much on fixing women and making women assimilate more into a male model of leadership? Or are these sort of courses really about trying to provide some sort of personal development pathway for women? And if they are, that's fine, but that is different. That if it's about helping women build resilience, helping them improve their capacity to work in teams, which quite frankly I think women are very good at anyway, but if it's about actually helping them on their career, well, that's a different thing, that's fine. But when we talk about women in leadership, just in a nutshell, I think we really need to ask ourselves, what do we mean by leadership? Do we want everyone to embrace leadership? Should they? Can they? No, I don't think they can. Do leaders need followers to actually be leaders? And we saw in the film, certainly, it was a key component lacking in Fabian's leadership. She didn't have followers. She lost her followers. She lost those participants the moment she made it clear that she was not listening. She wasn't hearing them. And she wasn't responding to the room. She wasn't responding to the audience. So that was quite fascinating. Globally, we're seeing right at the moment, particularly as a result of the global pandemic. Women's leadership has been highlighted around the world because the very few nations that have women as leaders, which is around 15 at the moment, out of 193 odd members of the United Nations, the bulk of those are doing better than major countries led by strong men. And we all know which ones they are. So women's style of leadership is being applauded and actually really coming under the spotlight at the moment. But then we need to ask, is that actually a female trait? Or is it that we're finally understanding the need to value better some of the things that women, through our conditioning because of cultural norms and social norms, are actually particularly good at, and we're suddenly beginning to realise we need to value those skills, those traits, those tendencies. And I'm not suggesting that leadership tendencies or traits are gendered. They are not. Biology does not determine leadership traits. Certainly cultural and social norms do, but they are pervasive. They are very, very powerful. We are all affected by our conditioning.
I mean, there was a point in the film where Sung Chao, the young woman from China, spoke about leadership in a way that just really got me into the core, where she talked about collective leadership. And in fact, in the synopsis at the end, when we finally saw a year later where all of these women had landed, she was continuing to lead in a way that was about community and bringing people together. And when we watched the film, the outtakes from a lot of the women of what they got from the program were not necessarily personal. They were about the community that they were able then to be a part of.
Absolutely. And can I just say, I think I've done many of these sorts of courses myself. I've been overseas to those 8-day, women's leadership courses. What you get out of it, sometimes it can be good theory, but predominantly is this powerful understanding that you're not alone. And it's the collective nature of the alumni that then work together, the network that's established. And it was said a number of times in this film that this was the biggest group of female scientists that any of them had ever seen in one place at one time. And that in itself was really powerful. And when you realise that you are not alone and that other women's experiences and their career trajectories, even though they might be working in a very different discipline, the fact that they are experiencing the same systemic barriers and obstacles that you are, that in itself can be really powerful. When you suddenly realise, I'm not alone, it's not just me, it's not my fault. There's a whole lot of stuff working against me and all these other women are experiencing it too. And then networking together as to strategies and even just providing support, the power in that is just priceless.
There was one statement at one point in the film where one of the women said she wanted to stop looking at herself and recognize that self-awareness was valuable. She wanted to stop focusing on that and start talking about the structural issues that were facing all of them and strategizing for how to solve them. Janelle, in your work, when you're working with communities that are trying to dramatically shift inequality for women, is it ever just one woman being a leader, or is it truly about that collective power that comes together to create change?
Look, I mean, I think there's a bit of both. There's no question that the power of collective is incredibly important, but I couldn't agree more with what Virginia said. It's not about fixing the women. It really is about looking at structural issues and making sure that we're inviting men to be part of the solution as well. And I think about a training that I participated in supporting that was for women political candidates in Solomon Islands a few years ago. And the training itself was one piece of the story. So in a country where at that time they'd had very few women represented in parliaments, we actually have the lowest number of women represented in parliaments in the Pacific when we take Australia and New Zealand out and anywhere in the world. And a portion of this was about providing women an opportunity to connect with other women and male allies who came along to be part of this process, to try to create a cadre of women who are prepared to run for election. And a component of that was absolutely teaching them about leadership, teaching them about how to put together their political platform, preparing them to be interviewed by journalists. But that's one part of the story. Another part of the story is changing norms and really trying to counteract those deeply ingrained senses of what a leader looks like. And so a component for UN Women was putting together radio programs radio programs in local language that followed the story of a woman running for election for the first time, but also a woman who was participating as a voter for the first time. And it's about trying to reach people where they are, providing really accessible sources of media to tell a story that women are leaders, that women are participants in politics by voting. But then there was a third part of it, which was about training members of the media, and whether that's in Australia and the United States and Solomon Islands, all over the world, we know that the ways that women are represented as leaders, oftentimes in media, is not focused on the issues. It's focused on things that are completely irrelevant and really perpetuate gender inequality and stereotypes. So those three things combined, I think, created a really, really powerful package. And in the last year, it's the first time Solomon Islands has 3 women represented in parliament. I know it probably doesn't sound like a lot. It's 6% in the scheme of a parliament made up of 50 people, but that's really important. We have to celebrate the incremental progress. But it isn't just about bringing women together on a journey to participate as leaders. It's bringing men on the journey, looking at how we're represented in media, and also looking at way everyday people are consuming messages around who is or isn't or can or cannot be a leader through the storytelling and radio.
So those triggers of progress are really critical here. And in a time of a global pandemic and economic recession, how do we ensure that those massive global challenges are not used as excuses to stop focusing on progressing gender equality and reducing violence, discrimination, and harassment against women? Virginia, what is the message you would leave viewers with on that front?
Once you start to understand the data and understand, the industry, or science industries, and how poorly women are represented, you start to really understand the urgency of getting more women into leadership positions and actually into STEM. And the data is terrible. We did see in the film, for example, 43% of women who, once they have children in STEM sciences, once they have children, they leave. They dump their career, and that is just heartbreaking. So I think the focus on women in STEM is critical, particularly when we know there is one area that we are getting huge investment in, something such as AI, for example, has such a tiny proportion of women working in AI. Climate change, for example, one of our global biggest problem right now, has so few, not enough women working in leadership areas. So the focus on women in STEM is critical, is fantastic, and I'm so pleased that this film's program did focus on that. I think the greatest takeout from the film is, well, for me, certainly, as I said, the value of collective support, the networking. And the other is that women are not the problem. Our social, cultural norms, our systemic barriers, they are the problem. So when we talk about leadership, we really need to talk a lot more about how do we unpack that and value diversity. Once you get diversity, once you understand that the more diverse your leadership team is, the stronger it is, the richer it is, the greater lived experience that's shared, the better the ideas. Once you understand that, it becomes easy.
Janelle, for you, when you reflect on how we keep momentum moving forward and progress not going backwards in these times, what's your takeout from this film?
Well, fundamentally, we know that during COVID-19, we are in the process of rolling back progress. So we know that through increased wage loss and job loss of women. We know it through increased violence against women. These are things that we saw reflected in the film, which obviously is pre-COVID. And fundamentally, in terms of takeaways, the power of the collective is incredibly important, to be able to create networks of women who see others like them. And by the like them, I just mean that there are women scientists who have encountered some of the similar barriers for people to be able to disclose their own experiences of discrimination, of sexual harassment, of abuse in the workplace, and know that there is a community of people who hear them and who will stand with them and who will be a resource. I know there was, in the end, there was a woman who said, within 24 hours, I get a response. I pose a question and I get a response. To be able to continue to build on that collective and invest in the power of women supporting women. But ultimately, we know the business case and the moral imperative of gender equality is absolutely clear, and it is fundamental to achieving our 2030 agenda. So for the United Nations, we want a more sustainable planet. In order to achieve that, we need to have women, we need to have a whole range of diverse people represented who are doing research, who are conducting experiments, who are thinking strategically and differently about how we're actually going to solve the climate crisis. We need to have women reflected in creating the questions that are the questions that we want to answer to create a more peaceful planet. So ultimately, when it comes to achieving our promise of 2030, which is 50-50, it's a healthier planet, more peaceful planet, more prosperous planet, gender equality is fundamental to achieving that agenda.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your reflections with us today. You've certainly created a platform for a lot of discussion on not just what we saw, but how we translate that into action. So